2 days ago, Cristobal became this season's first named Atlantic storm. Today, it's already dead, downgraded to a tropical depression this morning, and declared a post-tropical cyclone before noon. That's how fast the Atlantic is chewing through storms this year. And right now, 2 separate disturbances are racing to become the season's next name, Dolly, except one of them just had its odds of survival cut in the middle of the afternoon. The National Hurricane Center's own forecast literally changed midday. Development chances appear to be decreasing, they wrote, about a system that looked genuinely promising just hours earlier. This is what's actually happening across the Atlantic right now, why storms keep forming and then falling apart almost as quickly, and why the specific competition unfolding between these two systems is exactly the kind of shocking, real-time forecasting drama most people never get to see play out this clearly. Stay with me on this one, because watching a forecast literally change direction within a single afternoon, the way it just did for one of these two systems, is a genuinely rare thing to catch in real time. And I want to walk you through exactly what that looked like. Drop a comment and tell me if you're anywhere along the Gulf Coast, the Atlantic seaboard, or the Caribbean, because the guidance later in this video gets genuinely specific depending on where you're watching from. And if you want updates as this race for the name Dolly actually resolves, subscribe now, because this could shift again within the next day or two. Let's start with what just happened to Cristobal, because its entire life cycle genuinely captures the theme running through this whole season. Cristobal officially became the season's first named tropical storm on August 12, 2026. By the morning of August 13th, barely a day later, it had already weakened back down to a tropical depression. By noon that same day, the National Hurricane Center issued its final advisory, declaring Cristobal a post-tropical cyclone, essentially confirming the storm no longer had the organized, warm core structure needed to be classified as a tropical system at all. Think about that timeline for a second. A storm strong enough to earn an official name, gone, dead, downgraded twice within roughly 24 hours. That's not a normal life cycle for an Atlantic storm this deep into hurricane season. And it's exactly the kind of pattern that tells you something specific and significant about the atmospheric environment this year's storms are being forced to survive in. It's worth understanding exactly what the term post-tropical cyclone actually means, because it's a genuinely specific meteorological classification rather than simply a vague way of saying a storm fizzled out. The National Hurricane Center uses that designation when a system loses the defining characteristics of a tropical cyclone, most importantly its warm core structure, meaning the storm no longer draws its primary energy from the release of latent heat over warm ocean water in the specific, organized way a true tropical system does. Once a storm transitions to post-tropical, forecasters stop issuing the kind of tropical storm or hurricane-specific advisories that come with wind speed, probability cones, and landfall tracking, even though the remnant system can sometimes still produce meaningful rain and wind impacts as it continues drifting across open water. Cristobal crossing that threshold within roughly 24 hours of first being named is a genuinely fast collapse, reflecting just how hostile the atmospheric environment surrounding it actually was. Now let's talk about what's actually taking Cristobal's place, because the National Hurricane Center has been tracking 3 separate disturbances across the Atlantic simultaneously, and 2 of them specifically had genuine shots at becoming the season's next named storm, Dolly. Here's where the story gets genuinely dramatic in a way that rarely gets captured this clearly in real time. Invest 92L, the disturbance getting the most attention earlier in the week, saw its development odds change mid-forecast. As of 2 p.m. on August 13th, the National Hurricane Center specifically stated that development chances appear to be decreasing for that system. That's a genuinely notable shift in forecasting language, a system that had real momentum just a day or two earlier suddenly losing steam according to the agency's own updated assessment. Meanwhile, running right alongside that story, Invest 94L has been climbing in the opposite direction. If maximum sustained winds within that system reach 39 miles per hour, the National Hurricane Center confirmed, Invest 94L could become Tropical Storm Dolly, the next named storm of the season. Picture what's actually happening here. 2 separate systems, tracked simultaneously by the same forecasting agency, one losing its momentum in real time, while the other gains exactly the kind of organization needed to cross the naming threshold. A genuine live competition for a single name on this year's storm list, playing out within the same 24 to 48 hour window. If you found that explanation of the post-tropical designation genuinely useful, a like on this video helps more people understand exactly what these classification terms actually mean rather than treating them as vague, interchangeable weather jargon. Let's talk about exactly why Invest 92L's odds dropped so specifically and so quickly, because understanding the mechanism here is genuinely the key to understanding this entire season's broader pattern. According to direct meteorological reporting, Invest 92L is a tropical wave that's battling wind shear and dry air as it continues moving westward toward the Caribbean. Its probability for development has lowered compared to earlier in the week, and forecasters specifically noted that probability could continue to lower further, based on how its environment evolves as it approaches the Caribbean. Wind shear, the difference in wind speed and direction at different altitudes, physically tilts a developing storm's structure, disrupting the alignment between its lower and upper levels and preventing it from organizing efficiently around a single center. Dry air works against a storm through a completely different mechanism, getting pulled into the storm circulation and effectively choking off the thunderstorm activity a developing system needs to sustain and build itself. Invest 92L is genuinely fighting both of these storm-killing conditions simultaneously, which is exactly why its odds have been sliding in the wrong direction, even as it continues its physical journey toward the Caribbean. It's worth understanding exactly how forecasters actually track wind shear in real time, because it's not simply a vague, qualitative assessment. Meteorologists use satellite data and specialized computer models to measure the actual difference in wind speed and direction between the lower and upper atmosphere along a storm's specific track, generating what's called a shear analysis that gets updated multiple times daily as the system continues moving. When that analysis shows shear values climbing above roughly 20 knots along a storm's path, conditions become genuinely hostile to development, and values much above that threshold can actively tear apart a system's structure even if it had been showing signs of organizing just hours earlier. That's precisely the kind of rapid, data-driven reassessment that led the National Hurricane Center to specifically lower Invest 92L's development odds within a single afternoon, real, measured atmospheric conditions, shifting in a way their own models could detect and incorporate almost immediately. Here's the detail that makes this particular Atlantic season genuinely worth understanding in its full context, because none of this is happening in isolation. According to Fox Weather's hurricane specialist Brian Norcross, this has been a notably quiet start to the 2026 hurricane season, particularly across the Atlantic's main development region, the specific stretch of ocean between Africa and the Caribbean, where many of the season's most significant hurricanes typically originate. Government forecasters have directly tied that quiet pattern to a strengthening El Niño, a climate pattern that reliably increases wind shear across the Caribbean and the broader tropical Atlantic, systematically working against storm development throughout the season. NOAA specifically released an updated 2026 Atlantic hurricane outlook citing this looming super El Niño as a factor, working to limit overall storm activity, a direct science-based explanation for exactly the pattern currently playing out with Invest 92L's struggling development odds. If you found that explanation of how forecasters actually measure wind shear in real time genuinely fascinating, subscribe now, because I'll be applying this same kind of detailed, data-driven breakdown to whatever system develops next this season. Let's put this season's overall pace in genuine, concrete perspective, because the numbers make clear just how far behind a typical year this one has fallen. The 30-year historical average for a full Atlantic hurricane season, based on data from 1991 to 2020, is 14 named storms, 7 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes. As of this point in mid-August, this season had produced exactly 3 named storms. Arthur, forming June 17th, Bertha, forming July 20th, and Cristobal, forming August 12th and already gone within a day. 3 storms, against a full season average of 14. And it's worth understanding where this point in the calendar actually sits relative to the season's typical rhythm, because the timing makes this pace even more striking. The peak of the Atlantic hurricane season falls on September 10th, with the most significant activity typically occurring between mid and mid-October, according to the Hurricane Center's own historical data. In other words, the season's traditionally busiest stretch is only just beginning, and the Atlantic has produced barely a fifth of its full season storm count heading into it. It's worth understanding exactly why the naming list itself matters so much to this specific storyline, because the World Meteorological Organization maintains a strict, predetermined sequential list of names assigned to storms in the order they officially form each season. That means whichever system, Invest 92L or Invest 94L, actually crosses the 39 mile per hour threshold first claims the name Dolly, while the other, regardless of how close it came, either takes the following name on the list, or, if it never fully organizes, receives no name at all. That sequential system is exactly why forecasters and meteorologists tracking this story have described it as a genuine real-time race between 2 competing systems, since only the storm that officially forms first gets to claim that specific name, however narrow the margin between them ultimately turns out to be. Now, let's shift focus to that third disturbance briefly, because it adds one more layer to understanding just how much genuine live tropical activity is being tracked simultaneously across the Atlantic basin right now. Beyond Invest 92L and Invest 94L, forecasters have specifically flagged that residents in the Lesser Antilles, The arc of Caribbean islands, stretching from the Virgin Islands down toward South America, could see gusty winds and heavy rain by late in the day on August 14th, even without a fully organized tropical system directly responsible. That detail is worth understanding on its own terms, because it illustrates something genuinely important about tropical weather that often gets lost in coverage focused purely on official development percentages and named storm status. A disturbance doesn't need to cross the technical threshold into an official tropical depression or storm to produce real, tangible impacts: heavy rainfall, gusty winds, and localized flooding risk for the specific communities sitting directly in its path. There's a broader piece of historical context worth adding here, too, because this isn't the first time an Atlantic season has started this slowly, only to accelerate dramatically once the calendar reached its traditional peak window. Seasonal hurricane activity is famously front-loaded toward the back half of the summer and into fall, precisely because ocean temperatures across the main development region continue warming through the season, while the specific atmospheric disruptions currently plaguing systems like Invest 92L, strengthening El Niño, don't necessarily remain constant in strength throughout the entire season either. Some historical Atlantic seasons that started notably slow in June and July went on to produce a genuine cluster of significant storms once conditions shifted later in the summer, which is exactly why meteorologists have been consistent in cautioning against reading too much into a slow start as any kind of guarantee about how the rest of the season will ultimately play out. It's also worth understanding what actually happens to a system like Invest 92L if its development odds continue falling towards zero rather than ever crossing the naming threshold. Not every tropical wave that enters the Atlantic's main development region goes on to become a named storm, and that's genuinely the normal expected outcome for the majority of tropical waves crossing off the African coast throughout any given season. A wave that fails to organize typically continues drifting westward, gradually losing whatever thunderstorm activity it had, sometimes reduced to nothing more than a broad, unremarkable area of showers before it even reaches the Caribbean, while occasionally still contributing localized heavy rainfall to whatever islands or coastlines happen to sit directly in its path, exactly the kind of impact currently being flagged for the Lesser Antilles, even as Invest 92L's own formal development odds continue declining. There's also a genuinely important distinction worth understanding between Invest 92L's declining odds and what that actually means for anyone specifically watching the Caribbean or the U.S. mainland for potential impacts. A dropping development probability doesn't necessarily mean the system disappears entirely or stops producing any weather impact at all. It means the system is becoming less likely to organize into the kind of tightly wound, officially classified tropical cyclone that would earn a name and trigger the full suite of hurricane-specific forecasting products, watches, warnings, and landfall probability cones. The disorganized moisture and instability associated with the system can still very much continue producing meaningful rainfall and gusty conditions as it continues its westward track, which is exactly the distinction forecasters were drawing when they specifically flagged potential impacts for the Lesser Antilles, even while simultaneously lowering the system's overall odds of achieving formal tropical storm status. If you found that naming convention detail genuinely interesting, on this video helps more people understand exactly why. Meteorologists talk about storms racing each other for a specific name, rather than simply describing multiple disturbances developing independently. Let's talk about what happens next for whichever system actually does end up claiming the name Dolly, because that's genuinely the open question driving the most attention across the Atlantic right now. Invest 94L's path toward potentially becoming Dolly hinges entirely on whether its maximum sustained winds can reach that 39 mile per hour threshold, the specific, hard numerical line separating an unorganized tropical disturbance from an officially recognized named tropical storm. Crossing that threshold isn't guaranteed simply because a system is trending in the right direction. It requires the storm's internal structure to continue organizing efficiently, converting available ocean heat and moisture into sustained wind speed, all while navigating whatever combination of wind shear and dry air it happens to encounter along its own specific track, the exact same obstacles that have already dramatically lowered Investi. 92L's own development odds just days, sometimes hours, earlier in the same general stretch of ocean. So what does all of this actually mean if you live anywhere along the Gulf Coast, the Atlantic seaboard, or across the Caribbean, watching this unfold in real time? If you've made it this far into the video, subscribe now, because I want you following along as this specific race for the name Dolly actually resolves over the coming days. First, understand that, as of the most recent reporting, there's nothing representing an immediate threat to the United States from any of the systems currently being tracked in the Atlantic. Both Invest 92L and Invest 94L remain in the earlier stages of potential development, with genuine uncertainty still surrounding their eventual strength and track, uncertainty that's been directly reflected in how quickly the National Hurricane Center's own assessment of Invest 92L shifted within a single afternoon. Second, understand that even in a season running significantly behind its historical average pace, the traditionally busiest stretch of the calendar, mid-August through mid-October, is only just beginning, which means this specific pattern of systems struggling against wind shear and dry air is worth continuing to monitor, rather than assuming the season will simply remain this quiet through its remaining months. And third, if you're in the Lesser Antilles specifically, take the near-term forecast for gusty winds and heavy rain seriously, even without an officially named storm attached to it, since disorganized tropical moisture can still produce genuinely disruptive local flooding and wind impacts regardless of its official development status. Here's the thought I want to leave you with. And it's worth remembering the next time a tropical outlook map looks quiet and it feels tempting to assume the rest of the season will simply follow that same calm pattern. Most people picture hurricane season as a fairly steady, predictable process. Storms form, they strengthen, they either make landfall or fade away over open ocean, following a rhythm that unfolds gradually across the summer and fall months. What's actually been happening across the Atlantic this particular week tells a considerably more volatile story, unnamed storm rising and completely dying within roughly 24 hours. One disturbance's development odds visibly dropping in the middle of a single afternoon's forecast update, while the second disturbance simultaneously climbs toward crossing that same threshold, just days behind it. It's genuinely worth remembering that the same forecast that flagged Invest 92L's declining odds at 2 p.m. on August 13th could look meaningfully different by the same time the following day, since these systems are, by their very physical nature, responding to atmospheric conditions that shift on a timescale of hours rather than days. That's not a limitation of the forecasting technology involved. It's an honest reflection of how genuinely dynamic and fast-moving these systems actually are, which is exactly why checking official National Hurricane Center updates directly, rather than relying on a single snapshot from earlier in the week, remains the single most reliable way to actually stay current on a story evolving this quickly. There's also a broader takeaway worth carrying forward from this entire episode, one that applies well beyond just Invest 92L and Invest 94L specifically. Tropical forecasting, even with the sophisticated satellite and modeling technology available today, remains a field defined by genuine, honest uncertainty rather than fixed, confident predictions issued once and left unchanged. A system's odds can rise and fall multiple times over the course of a single week, sometimes a single day, as it encounters new pockets of favorable or hostile atmospheric conditions along its track. That's not a flaw in how meteorologists communicate this information. It's an accurate reflection of how genuinely unpredictable individual tropical systems can be, even within a season whose overall pattern, in this case, one significantly suppressed by a strengthening El Niño, remains considerably easier to forecast in broad strokes than any single storm's day-to-day fate. That's not the story of a season quietly, predictably unfolding according to its historical averages. It's the story of an atmosphere and a handful of storms locked in an active, visible, rapidly shifting struggle, one that's kept this season's overall numbers well below where they'd typically sit at this point in the calendar. But that remains, by its very nature, too dynamic, and too fast-changing for anyone to safely assume has settled into any kind of predictable pattern, especially with the season's busiest stretch of days still just ahead.